I think what happened to native peoples in California in the middle of the 19th century was a racial foundation for what followed afterwards. And therefore it's important to understand it not just as an isolated incident, not just some terrible things that happened to one group of people in the middle of the 19th century or the latter part of the 19th century as well, but in a way set a sort of a standard and a framework for what followed. People do talk about it, and they use a language that evokes how extraordinary this moment was in the 19th century. They say it was a time when the stars fell and when the land was broken. And so while we know of California being a place that abolished slavery and was against slavery and voted with the Union and fought on the side of the Union in the Civil War, what many people don't know is that California also allowed Southerners who came to California with slaves to maintain that property. And so many Southerners came here, brought their slaves with them, and when slaves ran away for many, many years, they could go to court and get the courts and the power of law to back them up to recover their property. So to say that California was an anti-slave state is not totally accurate. There are these this sense that people could own other people was also recognized if they came into the state already owning them. Also, we tend to think of lynching as being a Southern phenomenon, but during the gold rush, close to 200 Mexicans that we know of were lynched, and lynching was widely practiced, as was the execution of native people without any kind of trial. So it's important when we think about the racial history of this country not to locate these kinds of tragedies just in the South, or think of slavery as being an exclusively Southern phenomenon. And then in the 19th and 20th century, we have the expulsion of the Chinese from the whole of the West Coast. In the 19th century, being purged from places like Eureka. It was here, not far from here actually, literally not far from here, between E and F streets in 1885, that a gallows was built and several hundred Chinese warned that if they didn't leave the next day, that they would be strung up there. And that was the beginning of the systematic expulsion of Chinese people from Humboldt. And also for many, many years, well into the 20th century, people of Asian descent were not allowed to work for the city or for the county. Of course, the Japanese throughout the West Coast are expelled during World War II, and there are many places where they have much larger populations than Eureka, but all the way from Washington all the way down to Los Angeles, you have people being rounded up and taken away to prison camps, sort of the modern form of the reservation in the 20th century. This history, I think, weighs very heavily over the present. The past, in this sense, is prologue. Out of sight, out of mind is typically how we deal with our tragic past, just as the brutal treatment of thousands of prisoners through social and sensory deprivation that I think amounts to torture up the coast of Pelican Bay is also hidden from public view until prisoners there protest. I, like many people, can easily be up here and spend a great deal of time up here, in a sense relaxing in nature and buffered from history, not thinking about those histories of the past that are so troubling. This began to change for me personally in 2006. First of all, my son, who'd been coming here for many years since his birth, 40 years earlier, and who had been very ill all his life, but had lived a long and productive and creative life, and had married and children and worked. But about a month before his death, he came up to Big Lagoon, and in our cabin journal, he wrote that when he died, he would like to have a Viking funeral at Big Lagoon, because Big Lagoon was that important to him. And a few weeks later, he did die, and we cremated him, but then we had to figure out what does it mean to give somebody a Viking funeral, and how do you do that? It's not like this normally takes place here in Humboldt or anywhere else. That got me and other members of the family and friends interested in rituals of death and rituals of mourning, and I started to, even though I knew quite a bit and read quite a bit about the history of the Yurok in this area and the history of other native groups, I never really looked at their rituals of mourning and how they deal with death and ceremonies of death and something. That wasn't something that particularly interested me, and I hadn't read about that or looked closely at that. But with Daniel, we had to construct this ceremony, and we did give him a Viking funeral. We the family and friends gathered at Big Lagoon, and we created a raft from local materials that we collected on the beach and around the lagoon. And we then created a platform on that raft, and we put his remains in a box and put that on his ashes on the raft. And then we, for those of us that found this personally important, we put personal things of his or ours with him, so that they would symbolically go with him into this journey that he was on. And then we lit the raft ablaze and set it off into Big Lagoon when it was dark. A very extraordinary, amazing experience. And so for me, ever since that moment in 2006, with that ceremony, coming back to Big Lagoon has now personally changed. So, and it's not a macabre relationship. It's not something that's negative, because I have a very, very close relationship with him and his life, and I'm very glad that he wanted to see his death connected to a place like Big Lagoon, to which I'm very connected. But it definitely changed my relationship to the place. Now understanding that a death had taken place here that was important to me, and that the significance of that death then changes my relationship to the land and the landscape and the people here. About a year after that, I was reading a local technical report done about Big Lagoon, and I tried to keep up on the literature of the area and try to learn about what's going on in the region. And in this report there was a paragraph there which I might otherwise have just skipped over, but it caught my attention because it was going through the history of Big Lagoon, and it said that early in the 19th century, in the 20th century, in the early and middle part of the 20th century, people had come to Big Lagoon and had gone to various places around Big Lagoon and had dug up the graves of native people that lived there, and had taken out not only the artifacts that were in the graves, but also had taken out the human remains. I understood people digging up graves for artifacts, but it was a shock to me that people had dug up these graves and taken away the human remains as well. So every time I'm at Big Lagoon and walk from my cabin down to the lagoon or to the ocean or to the beach there, I go past one of these places, this huge meadow there, where I knew that some of this desecration had taken place. And I felt an obligation, a responsibility, not just to keep walking past, but to try to do something about that. And because it bothered me personally that I could give my son the kind of dignified burial and send-off that he deserved and that the family deserved, and yet there were people here whose graves had been desecrated, and I couldn't really live with that kind of contradiction and that responsibility. So I and a group of people, beginning in 2009, organized people from a variety of organizations that are connected to Big Lagoon to come together, and in 2009 we formed this coalition. It's called the Coalition to Protect Yurok Cultural Legacies at Opiu Way. Opiu Way is the name of the main village settlement that was at Big Lagoon, the place where all the important ceremonies used to take place that the Yurok practiced there. The project of the coalition led me, as now a researcher, to start asking questions going back to this land and these graves that were dug up. How did this take place? Who was involved with it? What did they do with the materials they took out of the graves? And when I started trying to find answers to those questions, I had trouble getting very far. And so those questions then led to this book, and even though it starts in this very small local place, I ended up going to New York and going to Washington, D.C., and going to 3 museums in Europe as well, in Madrid, in Berlin, and in London, tracking down artifacts that came from this region.